Sarah Martinez wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that morning, her movements precise and automatic. The small coffee shop in Cedar Falls, Iowa, was her world now. Steam rose from the milk frother as she prepared another latte, the sound familiar and comforting. Outside, cornfields stretched to the horizon under a gray October sky. She had learned to find peace in the routine. Wake up at 5, open the shop at 6, serve the regulars their usual orders. Mrs. Henderson always wanted her cappuccino extra hot. Tom from the hardware store needed his black coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Simple requests from simple people living simple lives. That was exactly what Sarah wanted, simple. The bell above the door chimed as Jake Morrison pushed inside, shaking raindrops from his jacket. At 15, he was tall for his age, with Sarah's dark hair and his father's stubborn chin. He dropped his backpack by the counter and grabbed an apple from the basket she kept for him. "How was school?" Sarah asked, not looking up from the register. "Boring, we're studying the Cold War in history class. Mr. Peterson keeps talking about all these old jets and missiles like they're fascinating." Jake bit into his apple with a loud crunch. "I told him my mom probably knows more about planes than he does." Sarah's hand froze on the cash drawer. "What did you say?" "Just that you used to work with planes or something. Dad mentioned it once." Jake shrugged. "Peterson wants to meet you, says you could come talk to the class about aviation history." The coffee shop suddenly felt too small. Sarah forced herself to breathe normally. "Your dad talks too much." "Come on, Mom, it would be cool. When did you work with planes anyway?" Before Sarah could answer, her phone rang. The number was blocked, but something about the timing made her stomach clench. She almost didn't answer. "Martinez." The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, military. "Is this Sarah Elena Martinez, service number 4,477,239? The world tilted sideways. No one had used her service number in 12 years. Sarah gripped the counter. "Who is this?" "Ma'am, this is Colonel James Wright, United States Air Force. We need to talk." Jake was watching her now, his apple forgotten. Sarah forced her voice to stay steady. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. Call St. Phoenix. Graduated Top Gun in 2009. Flew F-22 Raptors out of Langley until 2012. Colonel Wright's voice left no room for denial. "Ma'am, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Sarah's legs felt weak. Phoenix. No one had called her that in so long she'd almost convinced herself it was someone else's life. "I don't know what you're talking about." "There's an F-22 in trouble over the Pacific. The pilot is Lieutenant Commander David Chen. I believe you know him." The phone nearly slipped from Sarah's hand. David Chen, her wingman, her friend. The kid she'd trained when he was fresh out of flight school, cocky and reckless and brilliant. She could see his grinning face as clearly as if he were standing in front of her. "That's impossible," she whispered. "David's not a pilot anymore. He quit years ago." "Ma'am, he returned to active duty 6 months ago. Right now he's flying a damaged Raptor over hostile airspace and his radio is down. We've lost contact with him completely." Sarah sank onto the stool behind the counter. Jake was staring at her with wide eyes, clearly hearing enough to know something was very wrong. The coffee shop that had been her sanctuary moments ago now felt like a prison. "Why are you calling me?" she asked. "I'm not in the Air Force anymore." "Because you're the only pilot who's ever successfully landed a damaged F-22 with complete electrical failure. Because Lieutenant Commander Chen specifically requested you if anything went wrong. And because, ma'am, we're out of options." The truth hit her like a physical blow. David was in trouble and somehow he'd made sure they would call her. Even after all these years, he still trusted her to bring him home. Sarah closed her eyes. She could see herself 12 years ago, 26 years old and fearless, climbing into the cockpit of a $50 million fighter jet like she was born to it. Phoenix rising from the ashes, they'd called her after she'd brought a burning Raptor home from a training mission gone wrong. The girl who could fly anything, land anywhere, make impossible decisions in impossible situations. That girl was gone. She'd buried her along with the uniform, the medals, and the dreams of flying among the stars. "Mom," Jake's voice was small, uncertain. "What's wrong?" Sarah looked at her son, 15 years old and still believing his mother was just a woman who made coffee for a living. He had no idea that she'd once been one of the best pilots in the world, that she'd flown missions so classified she couldn't talk about them even now. He didn't know that she'd given up everything to keep him safe, to give him a normal life. "I can't help you," she told the colonel. "I'm not that person anymore." "Ma'am, with respect, Lieutenant Commander Chen is flying a $70 million aircraft with experimental technology. If he goes down in the wrong location, it could compromise national security. More importantly, he's got a wife and a baby girl at home." David was married, had a daughter. Sarah remembered him talking about wanting kids someday, how he'd name his daughter after his grandmother. The thought of him scared and alone in a damaged jet made her chest tight. Where is he? She found herself asking. Approximately 200 miles northwest of Guam. He was part of a training exercise when his aircraft suffered catastrophic system failure. Last we heard, he was trying to make it to Andersen Air Force Base, but that was 4 hours ago. 4 hours? In a damaged F-22, that was an eternity. David could be anywhere by now or worse, nowhere at all. What kind of damage? The question came automatically, her training overriding her fear. Primary flight computer failure, backup systems intermittent. Last telemetry showed hydraulic pressure dropping rapidly. Ma'am, the bird is barely flying. Sarah knew what that meant. A Raptor with computer failure was like a race car with no steering wheel. The fly-by-wire system controlled everything from engine power to basic flight surfaces. Without it, the jet was essentially a very expensive glider. But David was still in the air after 4 hours, which meant he was doing something right. He was fighting to keep that bird flying, probably running through every trick she'd ever taught him. Mom, you're scaring me. Jake was beside her now, his hand on her arm. Sarah looked at her son, then at the coffee shop that represented 12 years of hiding from who she used to be. On the wall behind the register was a photo of Jake at his 8th grade graduation, beaming at the camera. Next to it was a picture of the two of them at the county fair last summer, both laughing at something silly. This was her life now, safe, predictable, far from the world of classified missions and life-or-death decisions. But David was out there, alone and in trouble. I need time to think, she told the colonel. Ma'am, we don't have time. Every minute we delay decreases the chances of getting him home safely. There's a transport leaving off at Air Force Base in 3 hours. You could be in Guam by tomorrow morning. I said I need time. Sarah hung up the phone and stared at it like it might explode. The coffee shop was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of rain on the windows. Jake was watching her with the intensity of a teenager trying to solve a puzzle. Who was that? He asked. Wrong numbers. That was not a wrong number, you went completely white. And what did they mean about flying planes? Sarah's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. For 12 years, she'd been just Sarah Martinez, single mom and small business owner. She'd never told Jake about Phoenix, about the missions, about the Medal of Honor that was locked in a safety deposit box across town. She'd certainly never told him about the mission that had changed everything. The bell above the door chimed again. A woman in her 30s entered, shaking off an umbrella. She wore a dark suit and had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Government, Sarah realized immediately. They hadn't waited for her answer. Mrs. Martinez, the woman approached the counter. I'm Agent Rebecca Torres, Department of Defense. I believe you just received a phone call. Jake stepped closer to his mother. Mom, what's going on? Sarah felt the last of her normal life slipping away. Jake, go upstairs now. But now... Her son grabbed his backpack and headed for the stairs to their apartment, but Sarah knew he'd be listening from the top of the steps. He was too smart and too curious to stay away. Agent Torres, Sarah said carefully, I told the colonel I'm not interested. I'm afraid it's not that simple. Torres opened a tablet and showed Sarah a satellite image, a white speck against the blue of the Pacific Ocean. This was taken 30 minutes ago. Lieutenant Commander Chen is still airborne, but his fuel situation is critical. Sarah studied the image. The F-22 looked intact from above, but she knew that meant nothing. The Raptor was designed to look normal even when it was falling apart inside. He's flying a search pattern, she realized. He's looking for something. Looking for what? Sarah traced the flight path with her finger. She knew David's flying style, his habits. This wasn't random wandering. He's trying to find a way home, but he's also, she paused, studying the pattern more closely. He's spelling something. Torres looked at the tablet again. Spelling what? PHOE, Sarah read, her voice barely audible. He's calling for Phoenix. Even now, hundreds of miles away in a dying aircraft, David was trying to reach her. He was using precious fuel to spell out her old call sign in the sky, hoping someone would see it and understand. The message is for you, Torres said quietly. He knows you're the only one who can help him. Sarah stared at the image until her eyes burned. David was out there, alone and scared, and he was calling for her. After 12 years of silence, he still trusted her to bring him home. But she wasn't Phoenix anymore. Phoenix had been young and fearless and willing to risk everything for the mission. Sarah Martinez was older, wiser, and had too much to lose. Why did you really quit? Torres asked. The question hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. She'd never told anyone the real reason she'd left the Air Force. Not Jake, not her ex-husband, not even the therapist she'd seen for 2 years after her discharge. "That's classified," she said automatically. "I have the clearance." Sarah laughed bitterly. Do you know about Operation Skyfall, about what really happened over North Korea in 2012? Tor's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw the slight tightening around her eyes. She knew. "You were following orders," Tor said. "I was following orders when I shot down an unarmed civilian aircraft because intelligence said it was carrying nuclear materials to Pyongyang." Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. Turns out intelligence was wrong. It was carrying medicine to a refugee camp. The words hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Sarah had never said them out loud before. For 12 years, they'd been burning a hole in her chest. 43 people died because I pulled the trigger," she continued. 43 innocent people, including 8 children. That's why I quit. That's why I buried Phoenix. Some mistakes you don't get to come back from." Tors was quiet for a long moment. That operation saved thousands of lives, if that aircraft had been carrying what intelligence believed. "But it wasn't," Sarah cut her off. "It was carrying baby formula and antibiotics, and I turned it into scrap metal over the Yellow Sea." The coffee shop felt like a tomb. Outside, the rain had picked up, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Sarah could hear Jake moving around upstairs, probably trying to hear their conversation. "Lieutenant Commander Chen doesn't know about Operation Skyfall," Tors said finally. "He doesn't need to know, he just needs someone who won't let him down." Sarah closed her eyes. "I'm not that person anymore." Maybe you're exactly the person he needs." Tors slid the tablet across the counter. "This is David Chen's service record. Graduated flight school second in his class. Top Gun graduate as of 2 months ago. Distinguished Flying Cross for a rescue mission in Afghanistan. He's a good pilot, Mrs. Martinez, but he's not you." Sarah didn't want to look at the tablet, but she found herself scrolling through David's record anyway. Commendations, successful missions, glowing reviews from superior officers. The kid she'd trained had become exactly the pilot she'd hoped he would. Except now he was alone in a broken jet over the Pacific, and all his training might not be enough. "What makes you think I can help him?" Sarah asked. "I haven't flown in 12 years, I don't know the new systems, the new procedures." "Because you've done it before. Because in 2011, you successfully landed an F-22 with total electrical failure after a bird strike damaged your primary systems. Because you did it in a snowstorm at night with a damaged landing gear." Sarah remembered that night. The bird strike had happened during a routine training flight, but nothing about the landing had been routine. She'd had to fly the approach by feel, using manual controls and pure instinct to bring the Raptor down safely. The investigation later called it the best piece of flying they'd ever seen. "That was different. I was 25 and stupid enough to think I was invincible. And now you're 38 and smart enough to know what's really at stake." Tors was right, and Sarah hated her for it. She was older now, more experienced, more careful. She understood consequences in a way her younger self never had. That should make her a better pilot, not a worse one. But it also made her terrified of making another mistake. "I have a son," Sarah said. "I can't just abandon him to go play hero." "Jake is 15, he'll be fine for a few days." Sarah's head snapped up. "How do you know my son's name?" "We know everything, Mrs. Martinez. We know about your coffee shop, your mortgage, Jake's grades at school. We know you've built a good life here." The implied threat was subtle but clear. They could disrupt her carefully constructed normal life if they wanted to. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same rage that had driven her to excel as a pilot. "You're threatening my son." "I'm pointing out that you have more to lose now than you did 12 years ago, which is exactly why David Chen needs you." Sarah wanted to throw Tors out of her shop, to go back to making coffee and pretending none of this was happening. But she kept thinking about David, alone in that cockpit, spelling out her call sign in the sky like a prayer. "Even if I wanted to help, I'm not current on the aircraft. I don't have security clearance anymore. I don't even have a pilot's license. All of that can be handled. There's a team standing by to brief you on the latest systems. Your security clearance was never actually revoked, just suspended. And frankly, Mrs. Martinez, licenses don't fly aircraft, pilots do." Tor stood up, smoothing down her jacket. "The transport leaves Offutt in 2.5 hours. That gives you time to make arrangements for Jake and close the shop." "I haven't said yes." "You haven't said no either." Tors headed for the door, then turned back. Mrs. Martinez, Phoenix was a call sign, not a person. The person is still here, still capable of doing what needs to be done. David Chen is counting on that. The bell chimed as Torres left, and Sarah was alone with the quiet hum of her coffee machines and the weight of an impossible decision. Upstairs, she could hear Jake's footsteps as he paced his room, probably trying to process everything he'd overheard. Sarah looked around the coffee shop that had been her refuge for 12 years. The familiar espresso machine, the mismatched furniture she'd bought at garage sales, the photos of regular customers on the bulletin board. This was her life now. Safe, predictable, far from the world of classified missions and split-second decisions that could kill innocent people. But David was out there. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she hadn't called in years. Lisa Park, her old wingman's sister, lived 2 towns over and had always said to call if Sarah needed anything. Lisa, it's Sarah Martinez. I need a huge favor. 20 minutes later, Lisa was on her way to watch the coffee shop and keep an eye on Jake. Sarah climbed the stairs to their apartment above the shop, each step feeling like she was walking toward a cliff. Jake was sitting on his bed, pretending to do homework but obviously waiting for her. His textbooks were open, but his eyes tracked to her immediately when she appeared in his doorway. "We need to talk," Sarah said. Jake closed his algebra book and looked at her with an expression that was part fear, part excitement. "You used to be a pilot." It wasn't a question. Sarah sat down in the chair by his desk, suddenly feeling exhausted. "Yes." "A military pilot." "Oh, yes. And someone needs your help." Sarah nodded. "Someone I trained a long time ago. He's in trouble." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. "Are you going to help him?" "I don't know. It's complicated." "Because of me." The question hit Sarah harder than she'd expected. She'd spent 12 years convincing herself that she'd left the military to give Jake a normal life, but the truth was more complicated. She'd left because she was broken, because she couldn't trust herself to make the right decisions anymore. "Partly," she said honestly, "I don't want to leave you. But if you don't go, someone might die." Sarah studied her son's face. When had he gotten so wise? Maybe. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Finally, he looked up at her with eyes that reminded her painfully of his father. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you happy here, running the coffee shop, I mean?" The question caught Sarah off guard. Yes, I am happy." "Really? Because sometimes I see you looking out the window like you're waiting for something that's never going to come. And when planes fly over, you always watch them until they disappear." Sarah felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. Her 15-year-old son had seen through her better than any therapist ever had. "I was a different person back then," she said quietly. "I made a mistake that cost innocent people their lives. I can't risk making another mistake like that." Jake was quiet for a moment. What if not going is the mistake? The simple wisdom of the question took Sarah's breath away. What if not going was the mistake? What if David died because she was too afraid to be Phoenix again? "I have to leave tonight," she found herself saying, "if I go." "Mrs. Park is already on her way over, isn't she?" Sarah smiled despite herself. "How did you know?" "Because you're my mom and you always have a plan." Jake stood up and hugged her, fierce and sudden. "Go save your friend." "Jake." "Go, I'll be fine. Mrs. Park makes terrible coffee, but I'll survive." Sarah held her son tight, breathing in the familiar smell of his shampoo and teenage boy. When had he gotten so tall, so wise? "I might be gone for a while." "I know." "And Jake, when I come back, I'll tell you everything. About Phoenix, about the missions, about why I really left." "Even the classified stuff." Sarah laughed. "Even the classified stuff." An hour later, Sarah stood in her bedroom, staring at a black duffel bag she hadn't opened in 12 years. Inside was everything she'd saved from her military career. Her flight suit, her helmet with the Phoenix decal, her wings, and a leather jacket that had seen her through countless missions. At the bottom of the bag, wrapped in tissue paper, was her Medal of Honor. She'd never been able to display it, knowing that 43 innocent people had died because of the mission that earned it. But looking at it now, she remembered the words of the general who had presented it. "For extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds." Maybe it was time to be heroic again. Maybe David Chen deserved the same chance at redemption that she'd never given herself. Sarah packed quickly, including clothes for several days and her old flight gear. She wasn't sure it would still fit after 12 years, but muscle memory was a powerful thing. As she zipped up the duffel bag, she caught sight of herself in the bedroom mirror. Sarah Martinez, coffee shop owner and single mother, stared back at her. But underneath, she could see the shadow of Phoenix beginning to emerge. There was no going back now. The flight to Guam took 18 hours, with refueling stops in California and Hawaii. Sarah spent most of the journey staring out the window of the military transport, watching clouds drift past like memories she'd tried to forget. The other passengers were mostly young airmen and Marines heading to their assignments in the Pacific, fresh-faced kids who probably thought war was an adventure waiting to happen. Sarah remembered being that young, that eager, before Operation Skyfall, before she learned that heroes and villains sometimes looked exactly the same from 30,000 feet. The woman sitting across from her was reading a paperback novel, something with a shirtless man on the cover. Every few pages, she'd glance up at Sarah with curious eyes. Sarah knew what she was seeing, a civilian woman in jeans and a t-shirt traveling on a military transport with no obvious reason for being there. If only she knew. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept drifting to David Chen. By now, it had been nearly 24 hours since his last confirmed contact. F-22 Raptors carried enough fuel for about 2 hours of combat flying, maybe 4 hours at cruising altitude with external tanks. David should have been on empty hours ago. Unless he'd found a way to extend his range. Unless he was doing something brilliant and desperate to stay airborne. Or unless he was already gone, and she was flying halfway around the world for nothing. The transport touched down at Andersen Air Force Base at 600 local time. Guam was hot and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made Sarah's clothes stick to her skin immediately. The base was a sprawling complex of runways and hangars, home to both strategic bombers and fighter squadrons that kept watch over the vast expanse of the Pacific. A young lieutenant was waiting for her at the base of the transport's loading ramp. He looked about 12 years old, with earnest eyes and an expression that said he'd been briefed on exactly how important Sarah was supposed to be. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. Colonel Wright is waiting for you in the command center." Sarah grabbed her duffel bag and followed Rodriguez across the tarmac. The base was already busy despite the early hour, with ground crews preparing aircraft for morning missions and the distant rumble of engines warming up. The familiar sounds and smells hit Sarah like a physical force. Jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, hot metal, and the indefinable scent of organized purpose that existed on every military base in the world. She'd forgotten how much she missed it. The command center was a low concrete building that looked like it could survive a direct hit from a meteor. Inside, it was all harsh fluorescent lighting and the constant hum of electronic equipment. Multiple screens showed satellite imagery, radar tracks, and weather patterns across the western Pacific. Colonel Wright was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 45, with graying hair and the lean build of someone who still flew regularly. He looked up from a tactical display as she entered, and she could see him evaluating her the way pilots evaluated aircraft, quickly, thoroughly, and with a professional eye for weaknesses. "Mrs. Martinez, thank you for coming," he gestured to the screens around them. "We've got a lot to catch you up on." "Is David still airborne?" "As of 2 hours ago, yes. We got a brief radio contact when he passed near a commercial airliner. Pilot reported seeing an F-22 flying erratically at low altitude, approximately 150 miles northwest of here." Sarah studied the map display. 150 miles put David well within range of the base, but something was keeping him from coming home. What did he say in the radio contact? Colonel Wright handed her a transcript. The message was brief: "Phoenix, find Phoenix, fuel critical, systems failing." Sarah's chest tightened. David was still looking for her, even though she was thousands of miles away. He was burning fuel he couldn't afford to waste, flying on instruments that were probably giving him false readings, all because he believed she could somehow save him. "We need to get him on the radio," she said. "We've been trying for 24 hours. His communications system is completely down. The only reason we know he's still alive is that airliner sighting and the fact that we haven't found any wreckage." Sarah turned to study the larger tactical display. The Pacific was vast and unforgiving, thousands of square miles of empty ocean where a single aircraft could disappear without a trace. But David was still out there somewhere, still fighting to bring his bird home. "What kind of support do we have in the area?" "2 KC-135 tankers standing by for aerial refueling if we can find him. 3 rescue helicopters positioned at maximum range. USS Columbia is approximately 6 hours away if we need a flight deck." Colonel Wright paused. "And we have an F-22 prepped and ready for you." Sarah's blood went cold. "What?" "You're going up to find him. You know his flying style, his habits. You're the best chance we have of locating him before his fuel runs out completely." I told Agent Torres I'm not current on the aircraft. I haven't flown an F-22 in 12 years. Major Kim is standing by to give you a refresher. Wright nodded toward a Korean-American woman in a flight suit who had been quietly reviewing checklists at a nearby workstation. She's one of our best instructors. 2 hours in the simulator, then you're airborne. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. This was happening too fast. She wasn't ready to climb back into a cockpit, especially not the cockpit of a $50 million stealth fighter. Colonel, with respect, this is insane. You can't just put a civilian in an F-22 and send her out over the Pacific. You're not a civilian. Wright's voice was quiet but firm. You're a pilot, maybe the best pilot I've ever worked with according to your file. My file is 12 years old. Flying doesn't forget. It's like riding a bicycle, except the bicycle costs $70 million and goes Mach 2. Despite everything, Sarah found herself smiling. Wright had a point. She could feel it already, the old instincts stirring to life. The need to be in the air, to be moving fast and thinking faster, to be part of the machine that could dance between earth and sky. But she could also feel the weight of 43 ghosts riding on her shoulders. Major Kim approached with a tablet in her hands. She was probably 30, with the confident bearing of someone who'd spent years teaching nervous students how to fly the world's most advanced fighter jet. Mrs. Martinez, I've got your simulator session set up. We'll start with basic systems and work our way up to emergency procedures. How long has it been since you've flown? Kim asked as they walked toward the flight line. 12 years F-22 out of Langley. What was your last mission? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Classified. Kim nodded and didn't push. Every pilot had missions they couldn't talk about, operations that officially never happened. But Sarah could see the curiosity in her eyes, the professional interest of one pilot trying to understand another. The flight simulator was housed in a building near the flight line, a full-motion cockpit that could replicate everything from basic flight maneuvers to complex combat scenarios. Sarah strapped herself in and immediately felt the familiar embrace of an ejection seat, the weight of a helmet on her head, the slight pressure of the oxygen mask against her face. For 12 years, she'd dreamed about this moment. Sometimes they were nightmares, the cockpit filling with smoke and alarms while innocent voices screamed over the radio. But sometimes they were good dreams, memories of flying through crystal-clear skies with the world spread out below like a map of infinite possibilities. Let's start with basic flight controls, Kim said through the intercom. Just get a feel for the aircraft again. The simulator's screens came to life, showing a perfect blue sky above Guam. Sarah's hands found the flight controls automatically, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. She advanced the throttles and felt the virtual Raptor surge forward. It was like coming home. For the next 2 hours, Kim put Sarah through her paces: basic maneuvers, emergency procedures, weapons systems, electronic warfare protocols. With each exercise, Sarah felt more of her old confidence returning. The F-22 was a complex machine, but it was still fundamentally an aircraft, and she had always understood aircraft better than she understood people. Your touch is still there, Kim said as they ran through a simulated engine failure scenario. You handle emergencies like someone with a lot more than 2 hours of recent simulator time. Emergency procedures don't change much. Physics is physics. Maybe, but there's something else. You fly like someone who's been in real trouble before. Sarah executed a perfect dead-stick landing, bringing the virtual Raptor down without engine power. Everyone gets in trouble eventually. After the simulator session, Kim walked Sarah to the flight line where a real F-22 was waiting. The aircraft was beautiful in the way that only military hardware could be beautiful. Sleek, purposeful, designed for a single function that it performed better than anything else in the world. She's all yours, Kim said. Fuel, oxygen, and weapons systems are all green. Latest software updates, full defensive countermeasures suite. This bird is as good as they come. Sarah did a careful walk-around inspection, checking control surfaces, intake ports, and weapons bay doors. The Raptor looked perfect, but appearances could be deceiving. She'd seen aircraft that looked flawless from the outside but were death traps waiting to happen. What's the weather looking like? She asked. Clear skies for the next 6 hours, then a tropical storm system moving in from the east. If we don't find Lieutenant Commander Chen before that storm hits, we'll have to suspend search operations. 6 hours, Sarah nodded and climbed the ladder to the cockpit. The F-22's interior was exactly as she remembered, cramped, efficient, and surrounded by more switches and displays than a space shuttle. She strapped herself in and began the pre-flight checklist, each item bringing back memories of other flights, other missions. Phoenix, this is Guam Tower. You are cleared for takeoff on runway 06. Phoenix, they were using her old call sign. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she taxied toward the runway. For 12 years, she'd been Sarah Martinez, but strapped into the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, she was Phoenix again. Roger Tower, Phoenix is rolling. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt 35,000 pounds of thrust push her back into her seat. The Raptor accelerated down the runway like a rocket, and within seconds she was airborne, climbing into the blue sky above Guam at a rate that made her stomach drop. This was why she'd become a pilot. Not for the missions or the medals or the classified operations that kept politicians awake at night. For this moment when gravity released its hold and the world fell away beneath her wings. Phoenix, you are cleared to search Grid Alpha 7. Latest intelligence puts Lieutenant Commander Chen somewhere in a 50 square mile area northwest of your position. 50 square miles of empty ocean. Finding one aircraft in that much space would be like finding a needle in a haystack, except the needle was moving and might already be at the bottom of the ocean. But Sarah had advantages that the search and rescue teams didn't have. She knew how David Chen thought, how he flew, what he would do in a crisis. She'd trained him, flown with him, watched him develop from a cocky flight school graduate into one of the best pilots she'd ever known. If David was still alive, he would be trying to get home, but something was preventing him from making it to Anderson. His aircraft was damaged, his fuel was running low, and his communications were down. He was probably flying on manual backup systems, using basic instruments and his own skills to stay airborne. Sarah climbed to 30,000 feet and began a systematic search pattern, her radar sweeping the ocean below. The F-22's sensors were incredibly sophisticated, capable of detecting objects at ranges that would have been impossible just a few decades ago. But the Pacific was vast and unforgiving, and radar could only see so far. Phoenix, this is Rescue 7. We've got a possible oil slick at coordinates 15.2 north, 143.7 east. Could be aircraft debris. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the coordinates. An oil slick could mean David had gone down, but it could also mean nothing. The Pacific was full of ships, and oil slicks were common. She found the slick 20 minutes later, a dark stain on the blue water that stretched for about half a mile. Sarah dropped to 5,000 feet for a closer look, her heart pounding as she searched for any sign of wreckage. But there was nothing, no debris, no life rafts, no emergency beacons. Just oil, probably from a passing cargo ship. Negative on aircraft debris, she reported. Just oil, no wreckage visible. The search continued. For 3 hours, Sarah flew grid patterns over empty ocean, her eyes aching from staring at radar screens and her neck stiff from constantly scanning the horizon. Below her, the Pacific stretched to infinity in all directions, beautiful and hostile. She was about to turn back toward base when her radar caught something. A contact moving slowly at low altitude about 40 miles to the northeast. Too slow for a commercial aircraft, too high for a ship. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she turned toward the contact. Possible aircraft contact bearing 045, range 40 miles. Investigating. Sarah pushed the throttles forward and felt the Raptor surge ahead. The contact was barely visible on radar, just a faint return that flickered in and out of detection. But something about its movement pattern looked familiar. As she got closer, Sarah could see it clearly. An F-22 Raptor flying barely 500 feet above the water, its flight path erratic and uncertain. Even from a distance, she could tell the aircraft was in trouble. One wing was slightly lower than the other, suggesting possible control surface damage, and its speed was far below normal cruise velocity. "David," she whispered. Sarah keyed her radio. Lightning 7, this is Phoenix, how do you read?" Nothing. David's radio was still dead. Sarah moved closer, pulling alongside David's aircraft at a safe distance. Through his canopy, she could see him hunched over his controls, his helmet reflecting the afternoon sun. He was alive, but barely. His Raptor looked like it had been through hell, scorch marks along the fuselage, one of the vertical stabilizers partially missing, and obvious damage to the left wing. How he was still flying that aircraft was a mystery. Sarah tried the radio again. "David, this is Phoenix. Waggle your wings if you can see me." David's head turned toward her, and even through his helmet and oxygen mask, she could see his expression change. Surprise, relief, and something that might have been joy. He raised one gloved hand in acknowledgement, then made a series of hand signals. "Fuel low, communications out, flying on backup power." Sarah responded with her own signals. "Follow me, home is 30 minutes. But David shook his head and pointed down toward the ocean. Sarah looked and saw what had been keeping him from returning to base, a life raft barely visible against the dark water. "Survivors." David had found someone else in trouble, probably a civilian aircraft that had gone down, and he was staying on station to guide rescue forces to their location. Even with his own aircraft falling apart and his fuel running dangerously low, he was staying to help. That was the David Chen she remembered, the pilot who would never abandon someone in need, even if it meant risking his own life. Sarah keyed her radio to the rescue frequency. Rescue 7, this is Phoenix. I've located Lightning 7 and have visual on survivors in the water. Coordinates 14.8 north, 144.2 east. We need immediate SAR support. Roger, Phoenix. Rescue 7 is en route, ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Sarah looked at David's fuel gauge through his canopy and felt her stomach drop. He was running on fumes, probably had been for hours. There was no way he could stay airborne for another 20 minutes. Unless she could help him. Sarah moved her F-22 into a tandem formation with David's aircraft, close enough that their wingtips were almost touching. It was a dangerous maneuver, especially with a damaged aircraft, but it would reduce drag on David's Raptor and help extend his fuel range. For the next 15 minutes, they flew together in perfect formation, two of the world's most advanced fighter jets nursing each other through an emergency that could have killed them both. Sarah could see David fighting to control his damaged aircraft, his movements precise despite the obvious difficulty of flying a barely responsive machine. Rescue 7 has visual on survivors, the radio crackled. 3 souls in the water appears to be crew from a civilian aircraft, moving to recovery position. 3 people. David had risked his own life to stay with 3 strangers who had probably given up hope of rescue. Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with fear. This was exactly the kind of thing that made David Chen a great pilot and a good man. It was also the kind of thing that was going to get him killed if his fuel ran out before the rescue was complete. Phoenix, this is Rescue 7. Survivors are aboard. Lightning 7 is clear to depart. Sarah looked over at David's aircraft. His fuel gauge was showing empty, and she could see wisps of vapor trailing from his engines. He was flying on nothing but determination and the last few drops of jet fuel. She made a decision that would have horrified every safety officer in the Air Force. Sarah moved her F-22 directly above David's aircraft, close enough that her aircraft's thrust would provide additional lift for his damaged Raptor. It was called Formation Flying Assist, and it was incredibly dangerous under the best circumstances. With a damaged aircraft flying on empty tanks, it was nearly suicidal. But it worked. David's aircraft steadied as Sarah's thrust helped keep him airborne. Together, they began the long flight back toward Guam, 2 pilots and 2 aircraft functioning as a single unit. Lightning 7, this is Guam Tower. We have you on radar. Emergency equipment is standing by. David's engines flamed out when they were still 10 miles from base. Sarah watched helplessly as his F-22 became a $70 million glider, still flying but no longer under power. Without thrust, David would have perhaps 5 minutes before he had to eject or attempt a dead-stick landing. David, you need to punch out, Sarah called over the radio, knowing he couldn't hear her but needing to say it anyway. But David didn't eject. Instead, he continued flying toward Anderson, gliding his powerless Raptor toward the runway like he was performing a routine training exercise. Sarah followed him down, her own engines throttled back to stay in formation with his unpowered aircraft. The landing was perfect. Despite having no engines, no hydraulic power, and limited control authority, David greased his F-22 onto the runway like he was landing a Cessna at a country airport. The aircraft rolled to a stop just short of the arresting cables, and Sarah saw emergency crews rushing toward the motionless Raptor. Sarah touched down behind him and taxied to the parking area, her hands shaking as the adrenaline finally hit her. For the past 4 hours, she'd been operating purely on instinct and training. Now that it was over, she realized just how close they'd both come to not making it home. She shut down her engines and sat in the cockpit for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of emergency vehicles. Through her canopy, she could see David climbing down from his aircraft, moving slowly but under his own power. He was alive, they were both alive. Phoenix had risen from the ashes once again. David Chen looked older than Sarah remembered. The cocky 24-year-old pilot she'd trained had been replaced by a man with lines around his eyes and gray threading through his black hair. But when he smiled as she approached across the tarmac, she could see traces of the kid who used to do barrel rolls just to make her nervous. Phoenix, he said, pulling off his helmet, I was wondering when you'd show up. Sarah wanted to hug him to tell him how scared she'd been when she thought he might not make it home. Instead, she punched him in the shoulder. You idiot, what were you thinking staying out there with no fuel? There were people in the water, what was I supposed to do, leave them? Yes, that's exactly what you were supposed to do. There were other aircraft that could have handled the rescue. You nearly got yourself killed for nothing. David's expression grew serious. Would you have left them? Sarah opened her mouth to say yes, then closed it again. Because the truth was, she wouldn't have left them either. Even now, 12 years after Operation Skyfall, she still couldn't abandon people who needed help. It was a character flaw that had cost her everything once before. Come on, she said instead, let's get you debriefed. The debriefing took 3 hours. David's aircraft had suffered a cascade failure during what should have been a routine training mission. A software glitch in the flight control system had caused multiple backup systems to fail simultaneously, leaving him flying a machine that barely responded to his inputs. The fact that he'd managed to stay airborne for nearly 8 hours was being called a miracle by the accident investigation team. Sarah listened to David describe the emergency with professional detachment, but inside she was furious. F-22 Raptors didn't just suffer random system failures. They were among the most reliable aircraft ever built, with multiple redundant systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic breakdown. Someone had made a mistake, and David had nearly died because of it. The preliminary investigation suggests a software conflict between the primary flight computer and the new defensive countermeasures package, Colonel Wright explained as they reviewed the incident report. The two systems were apparently incompatible in ways that weren't caught during testing. So you put untested software on a combat aircraft and sent it out over the Pacific. Sarah's voice was dangerously quiet. Are you insane? The software had been thoroughly tested in simulation. Simulation isn't the same as reality, Colonel. You should know that. Wright had the grace to look embarrassed. You're right, mistakes were made. We're implementing new testing protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again. Sarah wanted to scream at him that new protocols wouldn't help David if he died out there, but she forced herself to stay calm. Getting angry wouldn't change anything. It never did. After the debriefing, David found her in the base cafeteria, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. He looked exhausted but alert, the way pilots always looked after a close call. Tired but grateful to be alive. You saved my life out there, he said, sitting down across from her. You saved your own life. That landing was incredible. I learned from the best. Sarah looked up at him. Did you really ask them to call me if something went wrong? David nodded. I put it in my emergency contact file when I came back to active duty. If anything happened to me, they were supposed to find Phoenix and tell her I needed help. Why? Because you're the best pilot I've ever known, because you taught me everything important about flying, and because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because I knew you'd come no matter what. The simple faith in his voice made Sarah's chest tight. I'm not the same person you remember, David. I'm not Phoenix anymore. Yes, you are, maybe you've forgotten, but you're still the pilot who brought that damaged Raptor home in a snowstorm. You're still the person who taught me that flying isn't just about operating a machine, it's about making impossible decisions under pressure. Sarah stared at her coffee. I made a decision once that killed 43 innocent people. I know. Sarah's head snapped up. What? Operation Skyfall, I know about it. That's classified. Not from me. I was read into the operation 6 months ago when I came back to active duty. They wanted me to know about the pilot who had trained me. David's voice was gentle but firm. I know what happened over the Yellow Sea. Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. For 12 years, she'd carried the weight of Operation Skyfall alone. The only people who knew the truth were intelligence officials who spoke in euphemisms about acceptable losses and operational necessity. No one else knew that Phoenix had shot down an unarmed civilian aircraft. Then you know why I can't be Phoenix anymore. I know you made a split-second decision based on the best intelligence available at the time. I know that if you hadn't acted and that aircraft really had been carrying nuclear materials, thousands of people could have died. But it wasn't carrying nuclear materials. It was carrying medicine. You didn't know that. No one knew that until after the fact. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. 43 people are dead because I pulled the trigger. 8 of them were children. You can rationalize it all you want, but that doesn't change the facts. David caught her arm as she turned to leave. Sarah, listen to me. What happened during Skyfall was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. I was the one flying the plane. I was the one who fired the missiles. You were following orders based on intelligence that turned out to be wrong. The failure was in the intelligence, not in your decision to act on it. Sarah jerked her arm free. You weren't there, David. You don't know what it was like. You're right, I wasn't there. But I've read every classified report, every intelligence assessment, every piece of documentation related to that mission. David's voice was steady, professional, and I know that any pilot in your position would have made the same decision. Would you have? The question hung in the air between them. David was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him working through the scenario in his mind, an unidentified aircraft approaching North Korean airspace. Intelligence reports indicating possible nuclear materials, orders to intercept and, if necessary, destroy. Yes, he said finally, I would have taken the shot. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. Then you understand why I had to quit, why I could never trust myself to make that kind of decision again. I understand why you think you had to quit, but Sarah, what happened today proves that you were wrong. What do you mean? You came back when I needed help, when I was in trouble, you came back. Even after 12 years, even though you thought you weren't Phoenix anymore, you climbed into that cockpit and did what needed to be done. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. That was different. Today was about saving you, not shooting down strangers. Was it? What about those 3 people we pulled out of the water? They were strangers, and you risked your life to help save them. You could have ordered me to abandon them and come home, but you didn't. Sarah hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been so focused on getting David home safely that she'd barely considered the civilians in the life raft. But David was right. She'd put herself at risk to help save 3 people she'd never met. Maybe she wasn't as broken as she'd thought. I need to ask you something, David said. Why did you really come back? Not the official reason, not because the Air Force asked you to. Why did you personally decide to come? Sarah considered lying, giving him some story about duty or patriotism or obligation. But David deserved the truth. Because I couldn't live with myself if I let you die when I might have been able to save you. Because even though I'm terrified of making another mistake, I'm more terrified of doing nothing when someone needs help. David smiled. That's Phoenix talking. Phoenix killed innocent people. Phoenix also saved my life today, and the lives of 3 civilians who would have drowned if you hadn't been there to help coordinate their rescue. Sarah sat back down, suddenly feeling exhausted. I don't know how to reconcile those things, the good and the bad, the lives saved and the lives lost. Maybe you don't have to reconcile them. Maybe you just have to accept that both are true and decide which one you want to define you going forward. Before Sarah could respond, Colonel Wright appeared at their table. Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we need to discuss your status. My status? Your security clearance has been fully reactivated. Your pilot's license has been reinstated. And as of this morning, you've been offered a consultant position with the Pacific Air Forces. Sarah stared at him. What are you talking about? We need experienced pilots to help with the investigation into today's incident. More importantly, we need someone to help redesign our emergency response protocols. What happened to Lieutenant Commander Chen could happen to any of our pilots. I'm not interested in coming back to the military. It wouldn't be military service. You'd be a civilian contractor, free to set your own schedule and work from wherever you want. You could even keep your coffee shop if you wanted. Sarah felt like the world was spinning around her. 24 hours ago, she'd been making lattes in Iowa. Now she was being offered a chance to help prevent other pilots from facing what David had endured. I need time to think. Of course, but Mrs. Martinez, what you did today saved lives. Not just Lieutenant Commander Chen's life, but the lives of those civilians and potentially the lives of future pilots who won't have to face the same equipment failures. After Wright left, Sarah and David sat in silence for a long time. Outside the cafeteria windows, the sun was setting over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Aircraft were taking off and landing on the runways, the constant rhythm of operations that kept the base functioning around the clock. What are you going to do? David asked finally. I don't know. My son is back in Iowa. My life is there. Your life is where you make it. And Sarah, Jake is 15. In 3 years, he'll be heading off to college anyway. What will you do then? Sarah had tried not to think about that. Jake was growing up fast, becoming more independent every day. Soon he wouldn't need her constant presence. What would she do with herself when she was alone in that coffee shop, making the same drinks for the same customers every day for the next 30 years? He's going to have questions when I get back, she said. About Phoenix, about my military service, about why I really left. Maybe it's time to tell him the truth. The truth is classified. The basic truth isn't that you were a military pilot who served her country and made difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. That you're a hero even if you don't see yourself that way. Sarah laughed bitterly. Heroes don't kill innocent people. Heroes make hard choices when no one else can or will. Heroes accept responsibility for their actions, even when those actions have unintended consequences. Heroes keep serving, even when serving hurts. David reached across the table and took her hand. You've been punishing yourself for 12 years for a decision that any reasonable person would have made in the same situation. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself and start helping people again. I don't know if I can. Yes, you can. You proved that today. That night, Sarah walked alone along the beach near the base, listening to the waves crash against the coral sand. The Pacific stretched out endlessly before her, dark water under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than they ever had back in Iowa. She called Jake from her borrowed quarters, using the base's secure phone line. It was morning in Cedar Falls, and she could hear him getting ready for school in the background. How was your first day back in a jet? He asked. Terrifying and amazing, Sarah smiled at his directness. Jake, I need to tell you some things about my time in the military, things I probably should have told you years ago. About the classified stuff. Some of it isn't classified anymore, and some of it, well, some of it you deserve to know even if it's still officially secret. Jake was quiet for a moment. Is it bad stuff? Some of it is, but not all of it. Mom, whatever it is, I can handle it. I'm not a little kid anymore. Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her son about Phoenix. About the missions, the training, the feeling of flying at the edge of space in a machine that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. She told him about David Chen, about the emergency that had brought her back to active duty, about the rescue mission over the Pacific. She even told him about Operation Skyfall. Jake listened without interrupting, absorbing the story of his mother's secret life with the serious attention of someone much older than 15. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Mom, he said finally, are you okay? The question caught her off guard. What do you mean? I mean, are you okay? You've been carrying all this around for my whole life and you never talked to anyone about it. That must have been really hard. Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks. Her 15-year-old son was worried about her emotional well-being. When had he gotten so wise? I'm working on it, she said. Being here talking to David, it's helping me understand some things I couldn't see before. Good, because Mom, you're the strongest person I know. If you made a mistake, it was an honest mistake. And if you saved people today, that's because you're a hero. Jake. No, listen, I've been thinking about this since you left. You gave up everything to raise me, to give me a normal life. But maybe normal isn't what either of us really wants. Sarah was quiet, waiting for him to continue. If they offered you a job, would you take it? I don't know, it would mean traveling, being away from home sometimes. So I'll be going to college in 3 years anyway. And Mom, I want you to be happy, really happy, not just making the best of it happy. Are you telling me to take the job? I'm telling you to do whatever feels right. If that means coming home and keeping the coffee shop, that's fine. If it means taking the job and helping other pilots, that's fine too. Just don't make the decision based on what you think I need. Make it based on what you need. After hanging up, Sarah sat on her bunk and stared at the official offer Colonel Wright had left with her. A consulting position with the Pacific Air Forces, helping to investigate aircraft incidents and improve emergency response procedures. Good money, flexible schedule, and the chance to prevent other pilots from facing what David had endured. It was also a chance to be Phoenix again, at least part of the time. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing an email to Jake's school, requesting permission for him to take a few days off for a family emergency. Then she called Mrs. Park and asked if she could watch the coffee shop for another week. She had one more thing to do before she could make her decision. The next morning, Sarah was back in the cockpit of an F-22 Raptor, but this time she wasn't alone. Major Kim occupied the rear seat of a 2-seat trainer variant, ready to guide Sarah through a series of test flights designed to evaluate her current skill level. This is just to see where you stand, Kim explained over the intercom. No pressure, no judgment. We want to know if you're still capable of handling complex flight operations. Sarah nodded and began the pre-flight checklist. Outside the canopy, the morning sun was burning off the overnight clouds, revealing another perfect flying day. The Raptor's engines spooled up with their familiar whistle, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of power as they prepared for takeoff. Phoenix, you are cleared for takeoff. Proceed to the training area and contact range control on frequency 290.5. Sarah advanced the throttles and felt the Raptor leap forward. But this time, instead of fear or uncertainty, she felt only joy. Pure, undiluted joy at being back where she belonged. The test flight lasted 2 hours. Kim put Sarah through every maneuver in the book: high G turns, vertical climbs, simulated combat engagements, emergency procedures. With each exercise, Sarah felt more of her old confidence returning. The aircraft responded to her inputs like an extension of her own body, and she found herself pushing the envelope in ways that would have terrified her just days before. Outstanding, Kim said as they returned to base. Your skills are not only intact, they're probably better than they were 12 years ago. You fly with more precision, more judgment. Experience has made you a better pilot, not a worse one. As they taxied back to the flight line, Sarah made her decision. That evening, she called Colonel Wright and accepted the consulting position. She also called Jake and told him they were moving to Guam. Really, his excitement was obvious even over the phone. We're actually moving to a tropical island. We're actually moving to a tropical island. You'll finish high school at the base school, and I'll be working as a consultant for the Air Force. What about the coffee shop? Mrs. Park wants to buy it. Apparently, she's always wanted to own her own business. Jake was quiet for a moment. Mom, are you sure about this? It's a big change. I'm sure. For the first time in 12 years, I'm absolutely sure about something. Then I'm happy for you. When do we leave? 2 weeks. That'll give us time to pack and for you to say goodbye to your friends. This is so cool. I'm going to be living on a military base in the Pacific. None of my friends are going to believe this. After hanging up with Jake, Sarah walked out to the flight line one more time. The F-22 she'd flown that morning was parked in its hangar, sleek and deadly in the fluorescent lighting. Tomorrow, she would begin working with the investigation team to understand what had gone wrong with David's aircraft. In 2 weeks, she would begin her new life as a consultant and part-time pilot. But tonight, she was just Sarah Martinez, standing in a hangar on an island in the Pacific, finally at peace with who she was and who she had been. Phoenix was rising from the ashes, and this time she was here to stay. 6 months later, Sarah stood on the balcony of their new apartment overlooking Apra Harbor, watching Jake practice surfing in the calm morning waters. At 16, he'd grown another 3 inches and developed the kind of tan that only came from living in the tropics. More importantly, he'd found his place at Guam High School and made friends with kids from military families who understood what it meant to move around the world. Mom, watch this, Jake called from the water, then proceeded to wipe out spectacularly on what should have been an easy wave. Sarah laughed and waved back, then returned her attention to the laptop balanced on the patio table. She was reviewing the final report on David Chen's aircraft incident, a document that had taken her team 6 months to complete. The investigation had uncovered a software integration problem that affected not just F-22's, but potentially every advanced fighter aircraft in the U.S. inventory. The fix would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and require months of testing, but it would prevent other pilots from facing the nightmare David had endured over the Pacific. Her phone buzzed with a text from David, "Coffee, I have news." 20 minutes later, they met at the base Starbucks, a surreal reminder that even on a remote military installation in the Pacific, some things remained comfortingly familiar. David looked relaxed and happy, a far cry from the exhausted pilot she'd pulled out of the sky 6 months ago. "How's Jake adjusting?" David asked as he sat down with his usual black coffee. "He loves it here. He's learning to surf, his grades are actually improving, and he's dating the base commander's daughter." "Brave kid." "Stupid kid. Colonel Peterson could have him transferred to Antarctica if things go badly." David laughed. "What about you? Any regrets about leaving Iowa?" Sarah considered the question. 6 months ago, she'd been making coffee for farmers and insurance agents in a town where nothing ever happened. Now she was helping to improve the safety of military aircraft while working part-time as a test pilot for experimental systems. The change had been dramatic, but she'd never felt more fulfilled. "None," she said. "What's your news?" David's expression grew serious. "I've been offered a position at Edwards Air Force Base, test pilot school, then assignment to the Experimental Aircraft Division. It's everything I've ever wanted professionally." "That's fantastic news. Why do you look like someone died?" "Because it means leaving Guam, leaving the team we've built here." Sarah felt a stab of disappointment. Over the past 6 months, she and David had worked closely together on the aircraft safety initiative. He'd become not just a colleague, but a genuine friend, someone who understood both her professional capabilities and her personal struggles with the past. "When would you leave?" she asked. 3 months, Sarah. They want you to." "What?" "The Experimental Aircraft Division. They want a consultant pilot with your background and experience, someone who can evaluate new systems and procedures from a real-world perspective." Sarah stared at him. "They want me to be a test pilot." "Not exactly. They want you to be the person who makes sure test pilots don't get killed by untested equipment. They want your experience, your judgment, and your ability to see problems that other people miss. The offer was tempting. Edwards was the premier flight test facility in the world, the place where experimental aircraft were pushed to their limits and beyond. It would be a chance to work on projects that wouldn't see operational service for years, maybe decades. But it would also mean uprooting Jake again, just as he was settling into life on Guam. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course, but Sarah, this could be exactly what you've been looking for. A chance to make a real difference in aviation safety, to help design the aircraft that the next generation of pilots will be flying." That afternoon, Sarah found herself in the cockpit of a modified F-22, participating in a test of new electronic warfare systems. The aircraft had been fitted with experimental equipment designed to detect and counter advanced missile systems, and Sarah's job was to evaluate how well the new gear worked under realistic flight conditions. Flying had become routine again in the best possible way. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her during her first flights back were gone, replaced by the confidence that came from hundreds of hours in the cockpit over the past 6 months. She was Phoenix again, but a wiser, more careful Phoenix who understood that every decision had consequences. "Phoenix, this is test control. Proceed to Waypoint Alpha and activate the new ICM suite. We're going to simulate a surface-to-air missile engagement." Sarah banked the Raptor toward the designated coordinates, flying at low altitude over the empty ocean north of Guam. The electronic countermeasures system was designed to confuse and defeat incoming missiles, but it was still in the early stages of development. Today's test would help determine if the system was ready for operational trials. "ECM system is active," Sarah reported. "I'm showing multiple contacts on the threat display." The contacts were simulated, generated by equipment on the ground, but they looked real enough to trigger every survival instinct Sarah possessed. Her training took over automatically, and she began the complex dance of modern air combat, jinking to avoid missile locks, deploying chaff and flares, using her aircraft's superior speed and maneuverability to stay ahead of the simulated threats. It was during this engagement that Sarah realized something important. She was having fun. For the first time since Operation Skyfall, she was genuinely enjoying the challenge of military flying. The fear was still there, the healthy respect for the dangers inherent in operating high-performance aircraft in challenging conditions. But the paralyzing doubt that had driven her from the cockpit 12 years ago was gone. She was finally ready to be Phoenix again, completely and without reservation. "Excellent work, Phoenix," test control radioed as the simulation ended. "The ECM system performed flawlessly. Your evasive maneuvers were textbook perfect." Sarah smiled as she turned the Raptor back toward base. Maybe David was right. Maybe Edwards was exactly what she needed, a chance to help develop the technologies that would keep future pilots safe. But first, she needed to talk to Jake. That evening, she found her son on the beach behind their apartment complex, sitting on a piece of driftwood and staring out at the sunset. He'd been quieter than usual at dinner, and Sarah suspected he'd overheard her phone conversation with David about the Edwards opportunity. "We need to talk," she said, sitting down beside him on the warm sand. "About California." "How did you never mind?" "Yes, about California, about the possibility of moving again." Jake was quiet for a moment, digging his toes into the sand. "Do you want to go?" "I want to make the decision that's best for both of us. This would be an incredible opportunity for me professionally, but you've just gotten settled here. You have friends, you're doing well in school." "Mom," Jake interrupted, "do you want to go?" Sarah considered lying, telling him that she was perfectly happy staying on Guam for the rest of her contract. But Jake deserved honesty. "Yes," she said, "I think I do." "Then we should go." "It's not that simple. Moving again would be disruptive for you." "So, I'm 16. I can handle being disrupted. Besides, how many people get a chance to live at Edwards Air Force Base? That's where they test all the experimental aircraft, right?" Sarah looked at her son with amazement. "How do you know about Edwards?" "I've been doing research ever since David mentioned it." "Mom, this is huge. They're working on hypersonic aircraft, space planes, next-generation fighters that won't be operational for 20 years. You'd be part of aviation history." "I'd also be part of a program that takes a lot of risks. Test flying is dangerous, even when you're just evaluating systems." Jake turned to look at her directly. "Is it more dangerous than what you did today?" Sarah thought about the morning's test flight, the simulated missile engagement, the complex maneuvers required to evaluate the new electronic warfare system. Not really. "Then what's the real problem?" Sarah was quiet for a long time, listening to the waves lap against the coral beach. I guess I'm scared, she sighed.